Hi there, I'm Olivia. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about weight and where the responsibility lies for being overweight. And I talk about this as someone, I'm a nutritional therapist, but I've struggled with weight my whole life. And I obviously look at dealing with it in a very different way now to how I did when I was younger before I trained in nutrition. But it's a big issue, literally, and many people face this issue, and yet we don't seem to be able to be moving forward with it. And I was listening to a discussion on the radio the other morning, and it was people ringing in to give their opinion on whether, as taxpayers in the UK, we should be forking out for the NHS to give treatments and pharmaceutical drugs and things to people for weight. And a lot of people, basically, I was kind of shocked because pretty much everyone said, why should we be paying for that? And it's just a question of, just make better choices. And obviously a couple of people rang in with a different view, and these are people that had struggled with weight themselves, but they tended to give the view that, well, it's a disease, there's nothing I can do about it. And it got me thinking, because I thought, well, where does the responsibility lie? And not because blame needs to be portioned out, isn't it? This is not, but it's more as someone, I think it's interesting because when you're dealing with it, is it helpful to see it as a disease, or is it helpful to see it as something that you can take full responsibility for? So here are my thoughts, and please do comment below. I'd be interested to hear what people think. But what I would say is that the arguments from the disease point of view come from the fact that there are brain changes that go along with being overweight. And I'm not, obviously there's also the arguments around genetics, and some people are more genetically likely to be overweight, but in all honesty it's about epigenetics, which is how we act, is how the environment, and the environment, I don't just mean external, I mean internal environment, how that acts on our genes. So there obviously will be a few cases of people whose genetics really do leave them open to putting on weight, and there are some conditions when people will put on weight, and I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about just the usual kind of weight problems that people have. But basically there is rewiring that goes on. We have the urge to eat that comes from a very primal place in the brain that's all about kind of avoiding pain and seeking out pleasure, which is really essential for survival. And for the most part it works, but it goes awry, and not just with eating but with other things too. And it's dopamine plays a big role in that because it's part of the whole reward system. And when we taking part in pleasurable activities, or the sight of pleasurable food, and that will cause a release of dopamine in the brain, and that's very it feels great, so you want that sensation again. But the problem is, because obviously everyone will experience that, the dopamine reward system is there in everyone's brain, so why do some people get affected more and everything goes a little bit out of whack and other people don't? And from my point of view, it's and from all the reading and researching I've done on it, it's very much to do with dieting for the most part. So when you start going down the dieting route and you're not eating quite enough, you're trying to undercut what you're eating each day, it will trigger those survival centers in the brain. They will start firing up like mad because all they want to do is get you to eat, and they don't really care about how nutritious it is. It's going to be about high calorie foods. So when you diet, you fire up the survival centers, which is why often people can, you can last so long on a diet and then you just cave in, and it's because you're trying to fight these really primal urges, and it is very, very difficult. They are very powerful and they're not to be underestimated. And over time, it doesn't happen overnight, but over time, if you keep doing those dieting, falling off the wagon diet, fall off the wagon cycles, then you need bigger and bigger amounts of food to create that same dopamine response. So it's as you can imagine, these cycles get bigger and bigger and more entrenched, and then the brain slowly gets rewired, and the brain likes to go down the path of least resistance, so it will do what it's done before, whether that's good for you or not, because it's only really caring about survival, that part of the brain. So you have the dieting industry and the rewiring of the brain. So totally understand that, you could look at that and say, well, that's, there are physiological changes. It's a disease then. And on top of that, you could also add in all the food industry and the processed food, ultra processed food. There's a fantastic book by Chris Van Tulleken, Ultra Processed People, and he puts it really well. It's quite a dense book, but it's really fascinating. And ultra processed foods basically are where you take the constituent parts of food, like oils and grains, and protein, sorry, having a hard time getting it. So the main constituents of food, they're broken down and then reconstituted together in a lab, and then chemicals and additives are chucked in there to make it taste nice. Well, nice, you know what I mean, palatable, and it's basically the whole Frankenfood thing. You break it all down. It was food. You build it up into something that, in all honesty, I think you'd be hard pushed to call it food. But the point is, it lasts longer on the shelf. That saves people money, I would argue, and he does too, and I think lots of people now would argue, that it's also made that way so that it's harder for people to stop eating. It makes it really difficult. It's no one overdoes it on oranges and grapes, and there's a reason for that. So you have the diet industry, the food industry, the rewiring in the brain. Okay, so that's really difficult. You could just kind of chuck your hands up in the air and think, right, well, there's nothing I can do about that. And so obviously a lot of people do. But then what about the other side of it? If you do that, to me, that's really disempowering, because I don't want to feel a victim to circumstances, and especially I don't want to feel a victim to, big multinational corporations, frankly. So I want to take ownership of it. But how can you look at it in that, what are the arguments of then looking at it for it being your responsibility, but without laying kind of blame at your feet? Because I think what I get shocked about is a lack of compassion that's around this argument. It's really weird, because with other problems that people have, there seems to be a lot more understanding and compassion, yet with food, maybe it's just hard for people to understand. If they've never had an issue with it, maybe they can't understand it. But I've had a bottle of wine, or a quarter of a bottle of wine, sat in my fridge for over a week now, and I'll probably end up binning it because I just keep forgetting it's there. I don't really feel like having it. And you see, imagine if then I use that argument for someone that struggles with alcohol, and just like, oh, well, why can't you just leave it? It shows a complete lack of understanding that actually for someone that has issues with alcohol, there'll be a whole load of reactions going on in their body just knowing that the wine is there in the fridge. So it's red wine. I probably shouldn't keep it in the fridge. Anyway, that's how little I think about alcohol. Whereas, other things in the cupboard, they create, or they're not so much anymore, but over the years they've absolutely created massive reactions in my body. So it is a very different thing that's going on. And when people yo-yo diet and have issues with food and weight, everything is wired to kind of make them want to eat these foods. But if you keep going down that route, then do you just say, okay, well, I'll never sort this out? And I kind of just know that there's a big no in me, and I don't want to hear it from someone who doesn't understand. I always like hearing from people that, might struggle with the same issue and hear their views on it. But for someone that doesn't understand, no, I kind of feel they should keep out of it, frankly. But from people that do struggle with it, well, what do you feel about it? Do you feel still that, yeah, you've got that agency over what you put in your mouth and the choices you make? And the way I was looking at it this morning was thinking about how, I look at health and well-being as, I work very holistically. Lightworknutrition, it's all about, energy flow, and food, high vibrational foods create flowing energy within the body. In many ways, and it's fascinating. So it's not just about, oh, salads are good for you, oh, that's bad for you. It's not that at all. It's actually looking at food in a much more holistic way. But it is very much about flow. And when you get stuck in patterns, so say like the dieting and yo-yo dieting kind of cycles and patterns, and you feel locked into that, it is because your energy is stuck. It's literally stuck and you can't move out of it. But what can help you move out of it, interestingly, is when you take ownership of it, and when you kind of call a spade and say, yeah, I've been making those choices. I've been choosing that stuck pattern because it's too painful to think about anything else, because it's too overwhelming, because ultimately, because there's fear underneath, for whatever reason, but there is that fear that's preventing me from feeling like I can break out of those cycles, because sometimes the pain is actually more comfortable than the thought of change. And it can kind of seem silly, but that's why so many people stay stuck in so many things, because it actually feels less scary than breaking out of it in the unknown. So once you start to take ownership over that, then actually that creates a bit of wiggle room, and the energies start to shift. And from that point, you can then start thinking, I feel, with taking that completely, I take very much a completely positive and compassionate and empathetic approach with people when it comes to food, because and this is what we need to do with ourselves as well. There is no beating people over the head and hoping that, you know, we're mean enough to them they'll change their behaviors. That just doesn't, maybe with some things, and maybe for occasionally with some people that might work with food, but in all honesty it doesn't really it just perpetuates the underlying feelings of lack of self-worth and all the things that go with being overweight. Most people know exactly what they you know, I shouldn't be eating that much, it'd be better if I didn't do that. They're not idiots, you know. So it's not about someone just pointing out to them, oh, maybe you're better off not having that. It's literally, food is being used for other things, and it's being used to kind of paper over emotional things that are going on underneath, and it's the feeling that you can't experience those emotions freely, and we like to, you know, numb ourselves. And I've done this my whole life, so I totally understand. And it can be really, really scary. But on the other hand, once you start to realize that you can make those choices differently, and it doesn't have to be in such a harsh, you don't have to do anything to the extreme. I don't advocate extreme diets at all, I do the opposite. And it's all about taking that gentle, compassionate approach to yourself. So overall, in terms of where the responsibility lies, I think it's really important to kind of feel like we have that responsibility, but also see that within the context that we live in a society that is very much made to make it difficult. And you know, so there's always nuance to these things. So I don't know, I mean, put your thoughts below. These are just my thoughts, but it would be really nice, I think, if I heard on the radio or on TV, if I actually saw some kind of proper discussions about it, and just a bit more understanding for a problem that's so you know, it's so widespread. We don't seem to have a great grip on it, and there's still a lot of blame and shame thrown around, and I just think that's, I really don't go for that. So yeah, please feel free to put your thoughts below, and I will be back soon with another video. Bye.